March 14th, 1943. North Atlantic, 400 miles southwest of Iceland. The corvette trembled like a wet dog as another wave crashed over her bow, sending green water cascading along the deck. His Majesty's ship Snowflake, all 925 tons of her, pitched violently in the gale. In the cramped wheelhouse, Lieutenant Commander Harold Chesterman gripped the compass binnacle and watched the storm turn the ocean into mountains of gray-green fury. The ASDIC operator's voice cracked through the speaking tube. Contact bearing 270, range 1,200 yards, moving left to right. Submarine contact confirmed, sir. Chesterman felt his heart hammer against his ribs. After 3 days of convoy escort duty through wolfpack-infested waters, after watching 2 merchantmen go down in flames the previous night, they finally had one. The German submarine that had been shadowing convoy HX-229 was now directly ahead, running deep, thinking itself safe beneath the storm-tossed surface. What the U-boat commander didn't know was that he was being hunted by a ship the Kriegsmarine had initially dismissed as a joke. The Flower-class corvette, designed in haste and built on the cheap, looked more like a child's bathtub toy than a warship. At just 205 feet long with a single 4-inch gun and a handful of depth charges, these little vessels had been derided by professional naval officers on both sides as utterly inadequate for Atlantic warfare. Captain Lieutenant Hans Joachim Hesse, commanding U-boat 638, would discover in the next 12 hours that Britain's cheap little ships had become something far more deadly than anyone imagined. The mathematics of survival in the Atlantic were about to be rewritten, not by battleships or destroyers, but by mass-produced escorts that cost less than a single bomber and could be built in a year. The transformation had begun 3 years earlier when the Royal Navy faced a crisis that threatened Britain's very survival. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't just a naval campaign. It was a race against starvation, and Britain was losing. September 1940. The Admiralty, London. First Sea Lord Admiral Sir Dudley Pound stared at the convoy loss figures with growing dread. In the first 9 months of war, German U-boats had sunk over 400 merchant ships, nearly 2 million tons of shipping sent to the bottom. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Britain imported 44 million tons of food and raw materials annually. At current loss rates, the island would be starved into surrender within 18 months. The problem was equally simple. Britain didn't have enough escort vessels. The Royal Navy had entered the war with just 97 destroyers available for convoy escort. They needed 500. Building traditional destroyers took 2 years and cost over £500,000 each. Britain didn't have 2 years. She didn't have the money. She needed something fast, cheap, and effective. The answer came from an unlikely source. William Reed, a civilian naval architect at Smith's Dock Company in South Bank, Yorkshire, had been quietly designing small commercial whalers before the war. These stubby vessels, built to chase whales through Arctic storms, possessed extraordinary seakeeping abilities despite their diminutive size. Reed proposed adapting the design for anti-submarine warfare. The Admiralty's reaction was predictable skepticism. Commander Clarence Howard Johnston, director of anti-submarine warfare, examined Reed's drawings with barely concealed disdain. "You want us to fight U-boats with glorified tugboats?" he asked. "These things are 60 feet shorter than our smallest destroyer. They'll be death traps in Atlantic weather." But Reed had done his calculations. The design could be built in any commercial shipyard with a slipway. It required no specialized equipment or skilled labor. Most importantly, it could be completed in 6 months and cost just £50,000, 1 corvette for every 10 destroyers. The Admiralty could have quantity instead of quality. Winston Churchill, newly appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, grasped the strategic implications immediately. "We cannot wait for perfect ships," he declared at a cabinet meeting in October 1939. "We shall build these corvettes by the hundred and pray they prove adequate. If they don't, we shall have lost nothing but money. If we don't build them, we shall lose everything." The first keel was laid at Harland and Wolff in Belfast on January 5, 1940. HMS Gladiolus, the prototype Flower-class corvette, slid down the ways on April 24th. She looked absurd. Her hull resembled a floating shoebox, all vertical sides and squared-off ends. The single 4-inch gun mounted on her bow seemed a child's weapon. Her maximum speed of 16 knots was slower than most submarines could manage on the surface. Lieutenant Commander Hugh Crichton, appointed as Gladiolus's first commanding officer, arrived at the shipyard and nearly requested a transfer. "She looks like someone built a warship from a garden shed," he wrote to his wife. "The crew quarters are smaller than our bathroom. The bridge offers about as much protection as a bus shelter. I've seen fishing boats that looked more warlike." What Crichton and the rest of the Royal Navy didn't yet understand was that the Flower-class corvette was perfectly designed for exactly one thing: finding and killing submarines in the North Atlantic. Everything else was secondary. The first corvettes entered service in April 1940, just as the U-boat campaign was intensifying. They were immediately thrown into the deep end, escorting convoys through the western approaches where German submarines hunted in packs. The early experiences were brutal. The corvettes rolled and pitched in ways that made destroyers seem stable. Crews were constantly seasick. Equipment broke down. The ships were wet, cold, and miserable. Sub-Lieutenant Peter Gretton, serving aboard HMS Campanula, recorded his first Atlantic crossing in his diary. "We rolled 45 degrees in both directions all night. Everything not bolted down became a projectile. The forecastle was constantly underwater. Men were injured simply trying to move about the ship. I've never been so cold, wet, and sick in my life. And this is supposed to be summer weather." The Germans watched with amusement. Captain Lieutenant Otto Kretschmer, already the top U-boat ace with 30 ships sunk, encountered his first corvette in May 1940. His war diary entry dripped with contempt. "Sighted small escort vessel today. Appears to be some sort of tug or patrol boat. Submerged to avoid wasting torpedoes on such an insignificant target. British must be desperate indeed to send such toys into the Atlantic." That contempt would prove catastrophic, because while the corvettes looked ridiculous, they carried weapons the U-boats couldn't match. Every Flower-class ship carried between 40 and 70 depth charges, depending on modification. More importantly, they carried ASDIC, the British sonar system that could detect submarines underwater. The ASDIC set on a corvette could detect a submarine at up to 2,500 yards in good conditions. The system worked by sending sound pulses through the water and listening for echoes. When a ping bounced back from a submarine hull, the operator could determine range and bearing with reasonable accuracy. For the first time in naval history, submarines could be hunted while submerged. But having the equipment wasn't the same as knowing how to use it. The early corvette crews were largely reservists and volunteers, many with no naval experience whatsoever. They had to learn submarine hunting through trial and error, with deadly consequences for failure. HMS Gladiolus made the first corvette kill on July 17, 1940. Lieutenant Commander Crichton had been escorting convoy OA-188 when his ASDIC operator detected a contact. What followed was a textbook attack that would be studied for the rest of the war. "Contact bearing 085, range 1,800 yards," the operator called. Crichton maneuvered to attack, running directly over the estimated submarine position while the depth charge crew stood ready. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3. 5 depth charges tumbled off the stern, set to detonate at different depths. The explosion sent massive columns of water skyward. Then silence. Crichton circled back, searching. His ASDIC pinged into the depths. Nothing. Then oil. Thick black crude oil spreading across the surface. Debris. Pieces of wood and metal. A German sailor's cap. U-26 would never return to port. Oberleutnant zur See Heinz Scheringer and his entire crew of 42 men were dead, killed by a ship the Kriegsmarine didn't consider a serious threat. But one kill didn't change German opinions. The U-boats continued to hunt with impunity, and the convoy losses mounted. By the end of 1940, nearly 4 million tons of Allied shipping had been sunk. Churchill called it the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost. The tide began to turn not through any single innovation, but through the systematic refinement of corvette tactics. Commander Frederick John Walker, appointed to command the 2nd Escort Group in November 1941, would become the man who taught the Royal Navy how to kill submarines. Walker was a 43-year-old career officer who had spent years developing anti-submarine tactics that the Admiralty considered unorthodox. Given command of a group of corvettes and sloops, he finally had the opportunity to prove his theories. His methods were ruthlessly simple: find the submarine, hold contact regardless of conditions, and attack repeatedly until the U-boat was destroyed or forced to surface. A submarine hunt is not a sprint. It's a marathon, Walker told his officers at their first briefing. Jerry expects you to make one attack, maybe two, then give up to return to the convoy. We're going to change that equation. We're going to hunt him for hours if necessary. We're going to exhaust his batteries, his air, his nerve, and then we're going to kill him. Walker's first major success came on December 17, 1941, when his group encountered U-boat 131. The German commander, following standard procedure, dived deep and began creeping away. Walker's corvette HMS Stork maintained contact for 16 hours, directing coordinated attacks by multiple ships. They dropped 120 depth charges before U-131 finally surfaced, crippled and sinking. The German crew, emerging from their steel tomb, were shocked to see multiple escorts surrounding them. "We thought you would give up after the first attack," one officer said during interrogation. "We kept waiting for the ping to fade. It never did. You stayed with us all night." This was the revelation. Corvettes couldn't outrun submarines on the surface, but they didn't need to. Their job was to detect, hold contact, and kill. Their 16-knot maximum speed was perfectly adequate for tracking a submerged U-boat limited to 8 knots underwater. Their seakeeping abilities meant they could maintain pursuit in weather that forced destroyers to ease off. Their low cost meant they could be built in numbers that allowed saturation of convoy routes. By early 1942, corvettes were being built by 28 different shipyards across Britain and Canada. Production had been streamlined to the point where a corvette could be completed in 4 months. The ships were being commissioned faster than crews could be trained. Young men barely out of school found themselves commanding warships after 3 months of training. Lieutenant Tony Trope, given command of HMS Sunflower at age 23, represented this new generation of corvette captains. "I'd never been to sea before joining the Navy," he recalled in a post-war interview. "Now I was responsible for a ship, a crew of 85 men, and protecting merchant vessels carrying food for Britain. The first time I gave the order to attack a submarine, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the binoculars." But these young officers learned quickly because they had to. The U-boats were becoming more aggressive. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the German submarine fleet, had implemented Wolfpack tactics. Multiple submarines would coordinate attacks on a single convoy, overwhelming the escorts with simultaneous assaults from different directions. The winter of 1942 to 1943 became known as the Black Winter among convoy veterans. U-boat production had accelerated. New Type 7 and Type 9 submarines were entering service monthly. The Germans had 240 operational U-boats by March 1943, and they were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. Convoy SC-118, sailing from Halifax to Liverpool in February 1943, lost 13 ships in a single night to a Wolfpack of 20 U-boats. The escorts, including 4 corvettes, were simply overwhelmed. The mathematics seemed impossible. How could a handful of slow, cheap escorts protect 30 or 40 merchantmen against a dozen submarines attacking simultaneously? The answer lay in the corvette's greatest advantage. There were enough of them to be everywhere. By March 1943, the Royal Navy had 275 corvettes in service, with another 100 building in Canadian yards. This allowed the formation of support groups, floating squadrons of escorts that could reinforce convoys under attack. HMS Snowflake was part of 4th Support Group when they received the distress call from Convoy HX-229 on March 14, 1943. Lieutenant Commander Chesterman pushed his little ship to maximum speed, racing through mountainous seas to reach the embattled convoy. By the time Snowflake arrived, 2 merchantmen were already burning, and the Wolfpack was pressing home its attack. That's when Chesterman's ASDIC operator detected U-638. Captain Lieutenant Hesse had positioned his submarine perfectly for a stern attack on the convoy. He never expected one of the escorts to break away and come hunting. As Chesterman lined up his attack run, the German submarine detected the corvette approaching and crash dived to 300 feet. well below the usual depth charge settings. But Chesterman had been at this game for 2 years. He knew the tricks. "Set charges for 150 and 300 feet, he ordered. "Standard pattern, let's shake him up." The first pattern of 5 charges exploded in a pyramid around the submerged U-boat. Inside U-638, the explosions sounded like the hammer of God. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation rained down from the overhead. Men were thrown against machinery. Hesse struggled to maintain control as his submarine bucked and rolled from the concussions. "Damage report," he shouted. "Flooding in the forward torpedo room," came the reply. "We can control it. Stern planes are jammed. We're losing trim." Hesse made the only decision possible. He ordered maximum speed and began a long underwater run, hoping to escape before the corvette could reattack. It was exactly the wrong choice. Snowflake's Aztec held contact perfectly. Chesterman simply followed, occasionally dropping another pattern to remind the Germans they were still there. Hour after hour, Snowflake pursued. The North Atlantic storm that made surface navigation a nightmare didn't affect Aztec performance at all. While Hesse's crew struggled with failing batteries and fouling air, Chesterman's men took turns on watch, rotating fresh operators to the Aztec set. This was Walker's doctrine in action: persistence over speed. After 6 hours, U-638's batteries were nearly exhausted. The air was so foul that men were passing out at their stations. Hesse faced the submariner's ultimate nightmare. He could surface and fight, almost certainly losing to the corvette's gun. Or he could stay down and die slowly as his air ran out. He chose to fight. U-638 broached like a wounded whale, her conning tower breaking surface in a fountain of white water. Before Hesse could man his deck gun, Snowflake's 4-inch weapon opened fire. The first shell missed. The second hit the conning tower, killing the bridge watch. The third penetrated the pressure hull forward. Hesse ordered abandon ship. As his crew scrambled into the freezing Atlantic, Snowflake closed in. Chesterman watched the German submarine settle by the bow, her stern rising higher and higher until she slid beneath the waves with a sound like tearing metal. 48 men had been aboard U-638. Snowflake rescued 17, including Hesse himself, pulled aboard unconscious and half-frozen. In the corvette's tiny wardroom, wrapped in blankets and drinking hot cocoa, Hesse stared at his captors with something approaching disbelief. "We thought your little ships were harmless," he said in passable English. "Scouts for the destroyers. We were wrong." Chesterman smiled grimly. "You're the 14th U-boat sunk by corvettes this year, Captain. I wouldn't call us harmless." March 1943 would prove to be the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. In that single month, Royal Navy escorts sank 15 U-boats. Corvettes accounted for 9 of those kills. The cheap little ships were proving deadlier than anyone had imagined. The statistics told the story. A corvette cost £50,000 and took 4 months to build. A U-boat cost 1.5 million Reichsmarks, equivalent to £150,000, and took 9 months to build. 3 corvettes could be built for the price of 1 submarine. The British were winning through sheer industrial arithmetic. But it wasn't just about numbers. The corvette design had been continuously improved based on combat experience. The later Flower-class ships carried more depth charges, better radar, improved Aztec, and heavier armament. The Castle-class corvettes introduced in 1943 were larger and more capable, with better crew quarters and superior weapons. More importantly, the crews were becoming expert submarine hunters. The terrified reservists of 1940 had evolved into hard-eyed professionals who knew every trick in the U-boat playbook. They developed techniques the Admiralty had never taught and wouldn't have approved. Lieutenant Harold Sherwood, commanding HMS Campanula, perfected the creeping attack, where 1 corvette held Aztec contact, while a second ship crept silently forward to drop charges directly overhead. The attacking ship, with engines at idle, was nearly invisible to German hydrophone operators who expected escorts to come roaring in at full speed. Sub-Lieutenant Robert Atkinson invented the observant technique, where depth charges were set to detonate at different times in the same area. The first explosion would force the submarine to maneuver. The subsequent charges would catch it as it tried to evade. German U-boat commanders found that escaping one attack merely positioned them perfectly for the next. The corvettes also became adept at exploiting German weaknesses. U-boats had limited underwater endurance, perhaps 24 hours at slow speed, before batteries were exhausted. The corvettes would simply maintain contact and wait, occasionally dropping a pattern to prevent the submarine from surfacing. Eventually, the U-boat had to come up, and when it did, the corvette was waiting. Captain Lieutenant Peter Kremer, commanding U-333, experienced this firsthand in May 1943. After attacking a convoy in the North Atlantic, his submarine was detected by HMS Leucistrife. Lieutenant Commander Stonehouse pursued for 18 hours, dropping occasional depth charge patterns. Kremer's batteries died. His air became toxic. He had no choice but to surface. The little corvette was waiting exactly where we came up, Kremer wrote in his memoir. They could have destroyed us easily. Instead, their captain called through a megaphone offering quarter if we surrendered. I had lost. The cheap British escort had beaten a modern U-boat through patience and persistence. By summer 1943, the corvettes had evolved into a comprehensive weapons system. They worked in groups, coordinating attacks like wolf packs in reverse. When one corvette detected a submarine, others would converge, forming a barrier the U-boat couldn't escape. The Germans called it the Corvette Curtain, and it was choking their submarine campaign to death. The Canadian Navy, which had barely existed in 1939, had become the third largest Allied Navy by 1943, with most of that growth in corvettes. Canadian shipyards built 122 Flower-class corvettes, and Canadian crews proved just as deadly as their British counterparts. HMCS Moosejaw, HMCS Sackville, and HMCS Chambly became legends in their own right. Lieutenant Commander James Prentice, commanding HMCS Chambly, sank Italy's top submarine ace Salvatore Pelosi along with his boat Tazzoli in May 1943. The Canadian corvette detected the Italian submarine in the Mediterranean and pursued for 9 hours before finally achieving a kill. Pelosi had sunk 24 ships. He died because a cheap escort wouldn't give up. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was devastating. The early war years had been a happy time when submarines hunted with near impunity. Now every convoy was protected by escorts that could detect, pursue, and kill submarines with mechanical efficiency. The hunters had become the hunted. Corvettenkapitan Heinz Eck, commanding U-852, wrote in his diary after barely escaping 3 corvettes in August 1943. The British escorts are relentless. They hold contact for hours. They coordinate their attacks. They seem to know where we will be before we get there. The sea is no longer our sanctuary. It has become our prison. The numbers confirmed German fears. In May 1943 alone, 41 U-boats were sunk. It was unsustainable. Admiral Dönitz temporarily withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic, conceding defeat in the campaign that was supposed to starve Britain into surrender. The corvettes had won. The victory wasn't clean or cheap. The Royal Navy lost 89 corvettes during the war, sunk by U-boats, aircraft, mines, and weather. Over 3,000 British and Canadian sailors died aboard these little ships. The corvette crews suffered casualty rates comparable to bomber crews, with the added horror of dying in the freezing North Atlantic instead of quick death from fighter guns. Lieutenant David Baum, who survived the sinking of HMS Auricula in May 1941, described the experience. The torpedo hit our engine room. We sank in 4 minutes. The water was so cold it felt like knives. Men died within minutes of entering the water, even those wearing life jackets. I was unconscious when they pulled me out. Of 85 men aboard, only 12 survived. But the corvettes kept coming. For every one sunk, 3 more entered service. The shipyards churned them out with assembly line efficiency. By the end of 1943, the Royal Navy had effectively unlimited escorts. U-boats could no longer operate with impunity anywhere in the Atlantic. The later war years saw corvettes adapted for new roles. They escorted Arctic convoys to Russia, where the cold was so extreme that spray froze instantly on rigging and superstructure. They supported the D-Day landings, providing anti-submarine screens for the invasion fleet. They hunted submarines in the Mediterranean, where clear water made ASDIC particularly effective. HMS Starward participated in 37 convoy escort missions without losing a single merchantman, a record unmatched by any other escort. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Neville Dickinson, received the Distinguished Service Order and became a corvette legend. His secret was simple: know your ship, trust your crew, and never give up contact. The U-boat will make a mistake eventually. Be there when it happens. The technological improvements continued throughout the war. By 1944, corvettes carried Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars that fired 24 bombs in a circular pattern ahead of the ship. Unlike depth charges that detonated by time or pressure, Hedgehog bombs only exploded on contact with a submarine. A single hit was usually fatal, and multiple hits guaranteed a kill. The statistics were remarkable. Hedgehog-equipped corvettes achieved kill rates 3 times higher than those using depth charges alone. HMS Loch Killen sank 3 U-boats in her first 6 months of service, all with Hedgehog attacks. The weapon transformed corvette effectiveness from hunter to executioner. German submarine crews developed superstitious dread of certain corvettes and their captains. HMS Sunflower and Lieutenant Commander James Plomer were credited with 4 U-boat kills and 11 assists. U-boat command warned crews to avoid this particular corvette at all costs. It didn't help. Plomer seemed to have an uncanny ability to anticipate where submarines would be. "We called him the Witch," admitted Oberleutnant zur See Friedrich Steinhoff after his capture in October 1944. "He found U-1062 when we were running silent at 300 feet. He held contact for 8 hours. When our batteries died and we surfaced, Sunflower was directly overhead. The man was either impossibly lucky or genuinely psychic." The truth was simpler. Plomer and officers like him had spent thousands of hours studying U-boat tactics. They knew how German captains thought, where they'd run, what depths they'd choose. Experience and intuition replaced luck. The corvette captains had become expert hunters through brutal trial and error. By 1945, the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over. U-boats still operated, but their effectiveness had collapsed. In the last year of the war, German submarines sank less tonnage than in any single month of 1942. The corvettes, supported by escort carriers and long-range patrol aircraft, had made submarine warfare unsustainable. The final statistics were staggering. British and Canadian corvettes sank or participated in sinking 97 German and Italian submarines. They escorted over 25,000 merchant ships across the Atlantic with steadily declining loss rates. After mid-1943, a properly escorted convoy with corvette protection had better than 95% chance of reaching port intact. The cost-effectiveness was extraordinary. 160 corvettes were built for less than £8 million total. Those ships protected billions of pounds worth of merchant shipping and cargo. They enabled Britain to survive, to build the forces that would invade Europe, to win the war. The return on investment was incalculable. Post-war analysis by both Allied and German naval historians reached the same conclusion. The corvette was the most cost-effective anti-submarine weapon system ever developed. Admiral Dönitz himself admitted in his memoir that the proliferation of escorts, particularly corvettes, made his submarine campaign impossible to sustain. "We calculated we could sink ships faster than Britain could build them," Dönitz wrote. "We never calculated they could build escorts faster than we could build submarines. The corvettes were crude, uncomfortable, and looked ridiculous. But they worked, and there were hundreds of them. That's what defeated us." The human cost was enormous on both sides. The Royal Navy lost over 6,000 men in corvettes and other escorts. The Kriegsmarine lost 30,000 submariners, 3/4 of all men who served in U-boats. The Atlantic became a graveyard measured in square miles, where cheap ships hunted expensive submarines to mutual destruction. But Britain survived. The lifeline across the Atlantic remained open. American supplies, Canadian grain, and vital raw materials continued flowing to British ports. By 1944, the convoy system was so effective that U-boats couldn't even attempt major operations against merchant shipping. The corvette veterans returned home with little fanfare. These weren't glamorous ships. There were no battleship actions to celebrate, no dramatic carrier strikes. Just month after month of gray Atlantic storms, depth charge attacks, and the constant fear of torpedoes. The corvette sailors had won the war's longest campaign through persistence, courage, and the simple refusal to give up. HMCS Sackville, the last surviving Flower-class corvette, sits today in Halifax Harbor as a museum ship. She's a tiny, ungainly vessel that looks utterly inadequate for ocean warfare. Visitors marveled that anyone would take such a small ship into the North Atlantic, let alone fight from it. Yet this little corvette and her sisters saved Britain from starvation and defeat. In the end, the story of the corvettes proves a fundamental truth about warfare. Sophistication and expense don't guarantee victory. Sometimes the cheap, simple solution works best. The Germans built submarines as precision weapons, expensive and complex. The British built corvettes as mass-produced utility craft. The utility craft won. The corvette crews themselves rarely spoke of their service. When they did, they focused on the misery, the constant seasickness, the bone-deep cold, the cramped quarters, the terror of depth charge attacks when you didn't know if you'd killed the submarine or merely made it angry. But beneath the complaints lay fierce pride. "We weren't glamorous," said Commander Chesterman in a 1968 interview. "We weren't fast or powerful. We were just stubborn. We'd find a U-boat, and we'd stay with it until it was dead, or we were. Usually, we won. Not because our ships were better, but because there were more of us, and we wouldn't quit." That's how Britain survived, not through brilliant strategy or superior technology, but through cheap little ships crewed by men who refused to lose. The mathematics of the Atlantic campaign were decided not in admirals' offices or design bureaus, but in freezing North Atlantic storms, where corvettes hunted submarines with relentless determination. The cheap little ships that professionals dismissed became the weapons that saved Britain. The corvettes proved that in warfare, persistence often trumps perfection. Quantity has a quality all its own. And sometimes the best answer is the simplest one: build more ships than the enemy can sink, and never stop hunting. The legacy endures. Modern navies still use the lessons learned by corvette crews. Anti-submarine warfare remains a game of patience and persistence. The tactics developed by Walker and his contemporaries are still taught at naval academies. The corvette spirit lives on in every small warship designed to do a dangerous job cheaply and effectively. Britain's cheap little ships won the Battle of the Atlantic through sheer bloody-minded determination. They proved that industrial capacity, properly applied, could overcome tactical brilliance. They demonstrated that average men in simple ships could defeat experts in sophisticated weapons. Most importantly, they showed that victory doesn't always go to the swift or the strong, but to those who endure. The corvettes saved Britain. That simple fact makes them among the most important warships ever built. Not the most powerful, not the most impressive, but the most necessary. When Britain stood alone and faced starvation, these ugly little ships kept the lifeline open. Nothing else mattered. The cheap became priceless, and the laughable became legendary.